margaretward.com.
Hello, I'm Margaret Ward. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you today about Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. I've compiled her collected political writings for UCD Press, and I've also written a biography of her, Fearless Woman. And I want to show you some of the activities that Hannah was involved in by reading a couple of extracts from my book. One will be about her work with the suffrage movement, and the other will be a small part of her participation in the Easter Rising. She's somebody that I feel should be up there along with the male giants of the period of the War of Independence. You know, we have the De Valiers and the Collins, but in terms of what she contributed to Irish society, both for women and also in terms of fighting for social justice generally, I would argue that Hannah was preeminent in this role. She even stood in 1943, 3 years before her death, as a candidate for the Dáil, standing on a platform for the Workers' Republic and for feminism. So I'm just going to get hold of my book and read you the first extract. So this is about the Irish Women's Franchise League and some of their activities in the period just before the First World War. The treachery of the Irish Party was a subject that Hannah returned to time and again in her addresses as chair of the League. Devising an appropriate political strategy was her preoccupation and her greatest talent. She was the political brain of the movement, its preeminent strategist, and this was the area upon which she concentrated her energies. Others were offering their services to candidates in local government elections or raising money through whist drives, making goods for stalls or rehearsing parts for the programme of Tableaux Vivants to be staged during the Daffodil Fête on the 14th of April. There were many different tasks for the suffragist, who was nervous of public speaking and who shied away from actions that might result in a prison sentence. Hannah was not one of those. Her latest prison experience had intensified her insistence that the League maintain its pressure upon the Irish Party. Her language was excoriating. The party had degenerated into the, to quote, appendage of corrupt liberalism and only responded to the crack of Mr. Asquith's whip. Most of the League's discussion nights were open to men as well as women, in keeping with their policy of wanting a society where women and men would contribute equally. But there were subjects that were difficult to talk about in mixed-sex groups, particularly for the younger single women of the group who were shy about speaking out on most topics. To encourage greater participation and to provide an arena for controversial topics like venereal disease and prostitution to be discussed openly, women's nights became a regular feature. Women who were not League members also came, so those occasions helped to build bridges between different groups. Single women, regardless of age, were constrained by the conventions of the period. They were not supposed to have intimate knowledge of sexual matters. Hannah, respectably married, had no reservations about leading off discussions on delicate subjects. With great relish, she volunteered to read a paper criticising a book by a young German philosopher, whose reactionary views on women had been causing a stir amongst those who had borrowed his book from the League lending library. Otto Weininger's Sex and Character, which had been published in 1903, characterised women as mere creatures of sex, divided into lover type and mother type. This pseudo-scientific rationalisation for women's exclusion from every form of activity ranging from science to the arts had a certain following during this period. James Joyce was convinced that Nora was living proof of Weininger's theory. Irish feminists had very different opinions and a lively debate followed. Hannah's exposition of this absurd exercise in wishful thinking. It was a good way to learn the art of public speaking. Violet Jameson, when asked to speak, replied that it was awfully kind, really have no right to attempt it as I've no experience, but she had the courage to suggest giving a talk on the relation of the suffrage to and its importance as regards what is politely known as the social evil. In this way, the movement provided young women with invaluable opportunities not only to speak, but to develop their thinking on key social issues of the time. In early March, as soon as the worst of the winter was over, the energetic team of Hannah and Meg came together again, this time for a speaking tour of those few counties that had yet to see a suffragist. Longford, Leitrim and Roscommon were, to quote, a disfiguring blot on the suffrage map, so into the west to wipe out that stain the pair went. The groundwork had been undertaken by Meg, who had visited the towns decided upon, talked to all the necessary magnates and booked the required halls. When they returned, however, it was to discover the combined forces of the Church and the Irish Party doing all they could to prevent the suffrage message from contaminating the women of their town. Only in Longford did all go according to plan. In Carrick, both Protestant and Catholic clerics had put pressure on the locals to ensure that no halls were available. There the women encountered, to quote, a howling, raging mob led by a drunken virago, who proceeded to create pandemonium for over 2 hours until the sight of 2 policemen dispersed them. So much for Carrick, Hannah wrote. Boyle was similarly exciting, with pressure from the local branch of the Ancient Order of Hibernians and the priests keeping away the crowds. Thanks to one friendly Protestant clergyman, they did get a hall and an audience. It was by no means a peaceful evening. A stone shattering one of the windows, together with fights between rival factions, ensured that the meeting received publicity in several papers. 5 baton charges, yards of shattered glass. What journalist could resist these appeals to copy, wrote Hannah. The stone that smashed the window was later auctioned off as a relic. Everything could be used to further the cause. It was hardly surprising that only the veterans of the League ventured so far from home. Strong nerves and unyielding commitment were essential. Okay, so just something about her experience of the Easter Rising next. Neither Frank nor Hannah could remain as onlookers when support was needed. Frank hated the thought of lives being lost because the gun had taken over, but neither would he permit the rising to be dishonoured because of the widespread looting being carried out by the Dublin crowds. Organising a citizens' militia so that order could be constructed out of chaos would, he decided, be his contribution. His intervention was totally consistent with his unshakable faith in the pacifist approach. He would try to prevent mob rule, but he would not directly assist the insurgents. No one would have dreamt of co-opting Skeffy without his permission. They had his open letter to Thomas MacDonagh to remind him of his strong objections to militarism. It was different with Hannah. On the Tuesday, the second day of the rising, once she knew what was happening, she walked with her husband the 2 miles from Rathmines to the centre of Dublin. Armed only with a cane, he was to spend that day pleading with individuals to stop looting the ruined shops and distributing circulars calling on civilians, men and women, to attend a meeting at the League's offices in Westmoreland Street at 5 o'clock. Hannah, looking at the action of Dublin's slum on holiday, mused sadly on Connolly's sacrifice for the citizens of Dublin and wondered if they were worth it. But she also understood what propelled, to quote, as she said, the ragged, smoke-grimed urchin hugging a huge pineapple to his tattered breast, the first and probably last chance of getting his young teeth into what was the preserve of the rich. She went straight to the General Post Office, headquarters of the insurgents, where Connolly and Pearce were busily organising their forces, to ask Connolly if there was anything she could do. His face, she recalled, was radiant, and he was in the midst of military activity and preparations. For her beloved Uncle Eugene, this was the culmination of a lifetime's hopes. Once Hannah had made the decision to offer assistance to the insurgents, it seems entirely fitting that one of the first people she should meet in the GPO was that dearly loved relative, 75 years old, in bad health, but as steadfast as ever in his commitment. As he'd been living in London, his good friend Tom Clark must have whispered that it was time to come home. Father Eugene cried out, "My God, Hannah, what are you doing here?" And she, with some humour, retorted in similar vein. He said he was here to give spiritual consolation. She brought what she considered to be of more importance, physical sustenance, and was bringing Tom Clark a cup of Bovril when the two met on an upstairs landing. It became a family tale, often recounted, even by those members who disapproved of the rebels. Aline Walsh, a member of the garrison, testified that when Desmond Fitzgerald, who was in charge of food supplies, asked for volunteers to bring over a sack of food to the College of Surgeons, Hannah volunteered to go with herself and Bridie Mahon. They had some difficulty in getting into the college as they were not recognised by those on sentry duty, but they knew Countess Markievicz and so were able to enter. Constance, in the thick of events, said she was amazed to recognise the voice of the person asking for Commandant Mallon. The woman, staggering under the weight of a huge sack bulging out into queer shapes and completely concealing her, was none other than Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, leading a party of laden figures, members of the Franchise League who had collected all manner of eatables from their friends and who braved the bullet-swept streets to bring them in. Constance had fond memories of that experience. It was, in her eyes, yet another instance when the Sheehy Skeffingtons instinctively took the right side and were always ready to help. Well, thank you for listening, and do go online and buy some of the books from UCD Press.